Sky News. The full story first.
Hello, it's Deborah Haynes here, and thank you for downloading these new episodes of the Wargame. I also wanted to tell you about our one-off live event happening in London in January. The Wargame Decoded will put you in the mind of the people who took part. Some of our participants, including Sir Ben Wallace, Amber Rudd and Jack Straw, will be with me on stage to talk through the decisions they made, the pressures they felt, and we'll let you experience some of the key moments of the game for yourself. How would the UK respond in a crisis? And how prepared are we? Join us for the Wargame Decoded on January the 29th in London. The details are in the episode notes. We've been tracking defence cuts and bad spending decisions since the end of the Cold War. But what about the impact they're having on the UK's ability to fight? Understanding that better was a key reason for running the Wargame.
We have 6 Type 45s. We have 1 at sea. Where are the others, please?
The others are in refit.
A big takeaway for me was the limitation of the UK's air defences. As we heard, 6 large warships called Type 45 destroyers are the only platform in the UK Armed Forces that can shoot down incoming ballistic missiles. But in the game, only 2 were operational, and one of them was hit in the first round of Russian strikes.
We can generally manage to operate 2. One is at sea and just being attacked. I think 1 has been damaged in the attack on Portsmouth. And the other 4 are in various stages of refit, and that means that they're not ready for sea. That they are absolutely of no value in the circumstances we currently find ourselves right now.
Our fictional scenario describes a very real problem.
Back when I was Min-AF, we were, having terrible difficulties with getting ships to sea.
Penny Mordaunt became the UK's first female Defence Secretary in 2019 for a few short months right at the end of Theresa May's time as Prime Minister. She'd previously spent 4 years as Minister for the Armed Forces, or Min-AF. It's the Defence Minister responsible for operations. She's also closely linked with the Navy.
I come from Portsmouth, so I'm steeped in all things Navy, and was a Royal Navy reservist for about 10 years, and I'm still in now as an honorary. In 2019, I got a second commission.
It meant Mordaunt had a much greater knowledge of defence than most ministers. This included an intrinsic understanding of how a habit the military had fallen into over the years of scrimping on things like spare parts for armoured vehicles, jets and warships to save money has a big impact on the ability to use them. She tells an extraordinary story of what the Navy had been forced to do to keep the few functioning Type 45 destroyers it did have operational.
Actually, a lot of it comes down to there isn't enough spare parts. So actually, when the Type 45s were being built, we were cannibalising off ships that were still in production line to put things that were going on those ships onto ships that were already in the water.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. So for actually comparatively...
Why is that?
Because it's budgets. Budgets are so tight that the normal and sensible resilience you'd have, literally down to what's in your stores.
Extra bolt nuts.
Exactly. Weren't there. So what I did was, both as Min-AF and because I knew I had a very short shift as Defence Secretary, I focused on those things.
As well as spare parts, another problem is having enough specialist personnel to build and maintain things like warships and even the UK's ultimate weapon, the fleet of submarines that carry the nuclear deterrent.
Our plans, and also for future capabilities, what we're building with other nations, they have to stand up to reality. They have to stand up to not just have you got enough of these particular parts and, what's in your stores and that supply chain, but also the people that need to build them and maintain them, those pipeline of engineers. And you have to, it's It's time consuming. I mean, on particular capabilities, I would meet weekly with all the players.
So which ones did you affect the availability of?
So I can't tell you that, and that should tell you the capabilities.
Okay, fine.
But the most fundamental capabilities that we have in this country.
And this all requires money. As we heard at the end of the previous episode, when Philip Hammond was Defence Secretary between 2011 and 2014, he tried to force the armed forces to live within their means.
The fear among the military was always, if you cut your coat to fit the cloth, when the Treasury sees that you've done that, they'll simply come along and take a bit more cloth away. And I had to satisfy myself in discussions with George Osborne that if we took some tough decisions, he wasn't going to abuse the work that the Ministry of Defence did and come back and try and top slice it again.
Hammond is referring to the then Chancellor.
Many people in the military might struggle to believe this. George Osborne was a passionate fan of UK military capability, genuinely interested in things military and genuinely wanting us to have a sustainable first-class military capability. But he did want it to be sustainable in financial terms, and he didn't want to be spending half of his life fighting rearguard actions by military officers accessing number 10 to try to undermine his budget planning.
Hammond's approach of fiscal realism may have been welcomed by the Treasury, but it did little to address whether the armed forces had sufficient weapons, ammunition and spare parts to do their actual job of defending the nation. I'm Deborah Haynes from Sky News and Tortoise. This is The Wargame, Episode 7, The Big Bluff. Remarkably, during Hammond's time in defence, the MOD 1 year experienced the rarest of phenomena: leftover money from their budget that hadn't been spent.
We definitely got the budget under control. We actually ran a surplus 1 year.
Didn't you give it
You gave £500 million back.
And I think, didn't you give it back to the Treasury on the promise that they would return it to Defence if Defence needed it?
It was a bit more complex than that, because it was around the way we deal with pension contributions, if I remember rightly, and how we score those. But a deal was done with the Treasury. It needed our surplus cash in year, and in exchange we got a good deal for the following year.
His successor, Michael Fallon, who took over as Defence Secretary in 2014 when Hammond became Foreign Secretary, has a slightly different recollection.
Philip did something quite extraordinary. He, in the end of the financial year 13, or it might have been 14 just before I arrived, he paid back to the Treasury. He underspent, and he paid back some several hundred million to the Treasury on the promise that the Defence would get it back again if they needed it. And I do remember some years later when we inquired at the prospects of getting this money back, people rolling along the floor in laughter. That was the end of that.
I put this to Hammond.
It was a bit more complex than that. I certainly wouldn't have advised anybody to operate on the basis that you treat the Treasury as a bank. But this was money that couldn't be spent sensibly with value, delivering value for money. There was always a value for money test. And it made sense to give it back to the Treasury rather than, spend it on some trumped up requirement.
He's right, of course, to a point. But given the first duty of any government is the defence of the nation, the decision at the time to prioritise fiscal constraint over military requirement, however poor the procurement process, is hard to understand, especially given what was unfolding.
Blast bombs, I think, they're coming in. The Russians have stormed the base, as you can see. They've smashed some cameras.
The Russian flag planted by an armed group who took control of the building at daybreak.
2014 brought the grim realisation that Moscow was once again seeking to change the land borders of Europe. Russian troops, described as little green men because they weren't dressed in uniforms that displayed their true identity, invaded the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, while Russia-backed forces launched attacks into eastern Ukraine. That same year also saw the rise of the terrorist group Islamic State in Iraq and Syria.
ISIS, or simply Islamic State as the group now wants to be called, used the internet and social media to deliver its potent message.
In a murderous rampage, ISIS declared a caliphate across swathes of the two countries.
The Islamic State, represented by senior figures, leaders and the Shura Council, resolved to announce the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate.
The simultaneous crises meant the UK and its allies had to mobilise. The Royal Air Force began conducting airstrikes against ISIS targets in Syria and Iraq, while special forces were secretly deployed on the ground. At the same time, in Ukraine, British troops were dispatched to help train Ukrainian soldiers to counter the Russian offensive. And then there was a wider push to deter aggression from Russia across NATO's eastern flank, with hundreds more British personnel sent to the Baltic state of Estonia. Despite these new threats, though, there was no decisive push by then Prime Minister David Cameron to put the UK back onto a war footing. Instead, for me as a defence journalist, it felt as though we as a country were increasingly bluffing when it came to our ability to defend ourselves and our allies.
Well, first of all, we weren't making cuts anymore. We were restoring cuts. We're able to increase expenditure and restore some of the capabilities, particularly the maritime patrol aircraft that had been cut back in 2010.
The then MP for Sevenoaks in Kent, Michael Fallon, was my local Member of Parliament, as well as being the Defence Secretary. He still defends this period. It was shaped by a defence review in 2015, which was presented to the world as evidence that previous cuts were being reversed. But they weren't. Instead, a lot of the plans to buy new kit were based on heroic assumptions that billions of pounds could be saved through ill-defined efficiencies that never really materialised.
So we were building up our defence again after the very necessary cuts of 5 years before, after the financial crisis.
The language that you would use when you were talking about, plans to increase this, increase capability, it kind of, were you worried that you were actually kind of just giving a false impression of a growth in strength, whereas actually it was a regrowth and a rebuilding from cuts? Like, were you not part of the bluff that was going on that was lulling the public into a false sense of security that we now see is completely blown?
Well, I inherited the cuts. I inherited the situation where these cuts had been made in 2010, and you and I can argue about whether those particular cuts went too far, too deep inside. But the big point is we reversed them. We reversed the cuts and we started growing the budget again.
Well, you started reversing the cuts. They've never been reversed completely.
Well, we started reversing them, and certainly I'd like to have gone, further and faster. But there it is.
And yet here we are, though, today, with a military that is absolutely not prepared for the threats that it currently faces. Like, don't you feel responsible, in a way, for part of that?
Well, I take responsibility for my time in office. Of course I do. I was responsible. I was responsible for the defence review. I think we got it right on Russia. I was responsible for the budget, which was increasing. You would have liked to have seen it increase further. It is now increasing further. And, the military, I hope, is recovering.
In reality, the military was, and still is, hurting.
I remember first week in the office, I was summoned to number 10 to talk to Philip Hammond, the then Chancellor, and Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, about why we needed money to bail ourselves out over the course of that year.
General Sir Nick Carter was made Chief of the Defence Staff in 2018. By then, in Downing Street, Theresa May had replaced Cameron and Hammond was in charge of government finances. In the security space, ISIS had lost most of the territory it had captured in Syria and Iraq, but the threat from Russia in Ukraine and across Europe was growing. How much was needed at that time?
Just for that year, we needed about £1.5 billion.
And what's that mean when you've got a £1.5 billion black hole? What would have happened?
Well, in year, it would have meant that we'd have had what the good old days they called a moratorium. We'd have had to have stopped activity, probably for 3 to 6 months. So no ships at sea, we probably kept the deterrents going, but we wouldn't have had any training or exercising or anything like that.
Scrapping exercises for troops, aviators and sailors is an easy way to save money quickly. But the long-term damage is huge, leaving the military far less ready to fight.
But the argument that swayed them was the argument that demonstrated that we had no stockpiles of the sorts of missiles that we needed to make the sorts of interventions that we were making regularly in Syria against ISIS and the like. And I realised then,
So what do you mean? So you're just saying we'd run out of bombs to drop on ISIS?
Absolutely, yeah.
And what did they say?
Well, they were horrified that, we'd run it down that long, and it was a very respectable argument for providing some money to rebuild the appropriate stockpiles.
Also banging the drum for more money from the Ministry of Defence was yet another Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson.
There was this sort of sense of, the MOD is always good for $1 billion from Treasury. You can always take $1 billion out of the MOD and nothing will really change. And maybe that had been the case in the past, but the cupboards were really bare. You were just taking the cupboards.
Division, clear the lobby!
A former chief whip, Williamson had no prior experience of running any other government department. He was the surprise choice by Theresa May to replace Fallon, who suddenly resigned in 2017 after saying his personal conduct may have fallen below the high standards required of the military. Now a backbench MP again, Williamson agreed to meet me at his office in Parliament, in between the ringing of a division bell that periodically summoned him to rush off and vote. When you went into the Ministry of Defence, did you think that the UK was much better defended than actually it turns out we are?
Yes. I was quite shocked as to how thin things were. I was quite shocked as to the amount of resilience and reserve that we had. I had probably a little bit believed the wonderful lines that would sometimes be trotted out. And as someone who is, immensely proud of everything that they sort of do, you sort of probably never really scraped back to see what was really there. And it quickly came clear in my mind, actually, also what I had to do, because literally within the first 24 hours, I was presented with a whole set of choices, all of which involved enormous slashing of what our armed forces were. It became clear in my head that my probably one job was to do everything I could do to avoid the types of cuts that were expected of me from the Prime Minister and from the Chancellor.
He claims May and Hammond didn't see the merit of having a large army that was able to fight a conventional land war, despite what Russia was doing in Ukraine.
The Treasury push was in terms of reduction in size of manpower, reducing the size of the army. There was meetings where I was told by those round the table that we only needed an army of 50,000. Treasury 50,000, and we had the argument because, of course, at that stage you hadn't sort of seen the use of tanks, and why does the British Army need to have tanks? Why does it need to have artillery? And I always seared onto my mind was Theresa saying quite clearly, there hasn't been a war on continental Europe for decades, so why do we have to have an armed forces that looks, very different? And she's right. I mean, armed forces do need to evolve and they do need to be incredibly different. I think there is a lack of understanding of the real threats that Britain really truly faced at the time. And the fact there was, a battle going on in continental Europe, even at that time. And, that was happening in Ukraine and the threats were already there, I think.
So you're being asked to get rid of tanks and artillery back in 2017?
Always part of the various options, but I knew instinctively in my bones, so to speak, that I didn't want to be the Defence Secretary that did a whole set of cuts that I felt fundamentally were the wrong thing to do, especially at that time where the threats were increasing, not declining.
But Hammond, as a former Defence Secretary himself, suspected this newcomer had merely fallen for whatever sob story he'd been told by the top brass. Though the then Chancellor's attention was also largely focused on the aftermath of the Brexit referendum rather than defence.
Gavin Williamson came in. The military polished up their bleeding stumps as best they could and convinced him that the UK's defence capability was about to collapse. And he came scuttling across the road to Downing Street to say, I need, billions of pounds more money. Cabinet government is difficult at the best of times. When I was Chancellor, between 2016 and 2019, were not the best of times. That was when life was even more difficult because of the Brexit challenges. Gavin Williamson as Defence Secretary was a particularly challenging Defence Secretary for the Treasury because he was a former Chief Whip and therefore had very strong networks in the parliamentary party. So it was not just the military, it was parliamentary colleagues who were problematic. So we had to meet him part way, but we were never convinced by the arguments that he was making. And we didn't think, to be honest, I didn't think that he had sufficiently interrogated the military begging bowls that had been presented to him.
His argument was that you and Theresa May just didn't understand the severity of the situation.
So his argument was that although I'd been Defence Secretary for 3 years, I didn't understand defence and he did.
I think it was more that you didn't understand the severity of the threat and the fact our defences need to be rebuilt at a greater speed. But I guess at the time...
Obviously, I believe I understood the severity of the threat. I'd been Defence Secretary for 3 years, Foreign Secretary for 2 years. But everybody has their specific perspective. When you're a departmental Secretary of State, your perspective is the needs of your department, especially if you're a newly appointed departmental Secretary of State. When you're the Chancellor, your perspective is the competing demands across government for the limited resources that you have available and at your disposal. And those different perspectives cause some tensions, and there's a need for tough decisions to be made.
Yet the military sources I was speaking to at the time agreed with Williamson. And by 2018, the threat from Russia had also become a deadly reality in the UK. Britain accused Moscow of attempting to kill Sergei Skripal, a former Russian double agent, and his daughter Yulia on the streets of Salisbury using a Novichok nerve agent. They both fell critically ill but survived. However, Dawn Sturgis, a British woman, accidentally came into contact with the chemical weapon as well and died. I challenged Hammond on all of this. And granted, you were dealing with a crisis in terms of the Brexit aftermath, which would have consumed the most of your bandwidth. But you also had the Novichok poisoning in that time, and the absolute recognition, dawning recognition that Russia was becoming an increasingly dangerous threat. I mean, looking back, do you regret not giving greater funding to defence at that time? Was that a mistake?
No, I don't think so. Russia is and was a dangerous, bad actor. It represents a serious threat to its neighbours, but I would suggest a less immediate threat to the UK. And, that's not to downplay the significance of the need for building capability against potential Russian aggression. It's just the reality.
The rift between the MOD and the Treasury led to some ugly attacks by both sides, including Williamson being dubbed Private Pike after the hapless Dad's Army character in the BBC television series.
And there was pretty vicious sort of briefings going on. But I was firmly of a view that if you were sufficiently obstructive, if you were unwilling to yield, I sort of thought they would ultimately probably yield. And we were able to rattle out extra money. It was never anywhere near enough for the type of investment we wanted.
What was needed? Do you remember? What were you asking for?
We were wanting like a couple of extra billion a year. I think it was 2.3 billion pounds a year. We got an extra 800 million pounds 1 year, an extra £1 billion the next, which when you actually look at the type of scale of what is needed now, looks such a small amount of money. But what it was doing, it was all about just trying to keep things on life support. It was just trying to keep that capability there, keep that sort of those skills there in order, because it's always easier to grow a capability as against having to start off right from scratch.
Why didn't defence capture people's attention and urgency? Do you think it just was that kind of peacetime mindset?
I think there was still a sense that, what they'd call a significant land-based war was never really going to happen.
They were very wrong. In 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The UK was and is a leading source of support for Kyiv, but decades of bluffing about Britain's hard power were about to be exposed.
Hey, it's Sophie and Will from Sky News.
Too many headlines, too little time?
We get it, and that's why we're bringing you Cheat Sheet.
10 minutes every weekday morning.
All the big stories from politics to pop culture, minus the noise.
No doom scrolling, no spin, just the stories that matter, from two people who live and breathe the news. Cheat Sheet with Ridge and Frost from Sky News.
Follow Cheat Sheet wherever you get your podcasts.
Boris was entirely leading the charge on Ukraine and helped it happen. He helped the lethal weapons into Ukraine happen when no one else was helping.
Ben Wallace, our Prime Minister in the Wargame, was the UK's real Defence Secretary at that time, under then Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Wallace took charge from Penny Mordaunt in 2019, who in turn had replaced Williamson after he was sacked following an inquiry into a leak of information from a National Security Council meeting about a Chinese telecoms company called Huawei. He's always denied responsibility. Wallace had previously served as Security Minister and had been an army officer before becoming an MP. He played a key role in pushing to send what limited supplies of weapons the UK did have to Ukraine to help Ukrainian forces repel the Russian attack. This included anti-tank missiles and old AS-90 artillery guns. Well, the few that still functioned.
The public should understand that across Europe, most of our forces had been hollowed out for 20 years. And on paper, they had numbers, but in reality, they didn't. I remember debating sending the AS-90, that's the 155 long-range artillery armoured vehicle, deep fires, they call it, that we sent to Ukraine. We had on paper 73. We only had 19 that worked.
Wow. How did that make you feel when you discovered that?
I was pretty angry. I mean, well, but it also made me feel that, that shows how we've been living on a sort of mirage for so long. As long as Trooping the Colour was happening and the red arrows flew and prime ministers could pose at NATO, everything was fine. But it wasn't fine, and the people who knew it wasn't fine was actually the Americans, but also the Russians.
So why was everyone being kept in the dark in the UK?
Well, because luckily for political leaders in defence, and it has always been such, and some of it's for a logical reason, the state of our defence is classified. It's secret. You know, the public aren't allowed to know our ammunition stocks. They're not allowed to know the readiness levels of different ships. If you go to Portsmouth and you see all the different ships, the public don't know whether one's at 5 days' notice to move or 200 days' notice to move or 20 days' notice to move. They don't know.
Would they be horrified if they did?
I think absolutely. I think that's why I fought for the extra money, and it had to be real money. So in many previous reviews, there was lots of, oh no, we'll have 20 billion of efficiency savings, and you can spend those. It's not real money. That was a lot of smoke and mirrors and tricks, and we needed significant, proper, genuine increase in the defence budget, a proper up, not an artificial up based on some here today, gone tomorrow efficiency saving.
He and General Carter, his defence chief, did secure an extra £24 billion for the armed forces as part of yet another defence review back in 2021. But it barely touched the sides. By this point, the military's biggest and most important procurement project was adding significantly to the budgetary pressure.
The nuclear deterrent was becoming more expensive every year, and that, of course, was having an impact upon the amount of money we could spend on conventional deterrents. I mean, when you think the nuclear deterrent is probably about 19% of the defence budget, you know, that is a lot of money.
The UK is renewing its fleet of 4 nuclear-armed submarines, as well as the missiles that launch the warheads and the nuclear munitions themselves. The predicted cost is £31 billion, with a £10 billion contingency. Most regard this as a price worth paying, as the deterrent is the cornerstone of UK defence and the ultimate guarantor of national security. However, the Wargame showed how the erosion of Britain's conventional military means a government is far more likely to be forced to resort to a nuclear strike if deterrence fails.
The UK and the Royal Navy Submarine Service has maintained a submarine at sea continuously for the last 60-odd years. So from day one of deterrence right the way through to today, there has been a nuclear submarine on patrol.
Vice Admiral Sir Nick Hine was what's known as Second Sea Lord, or the second in charge of the Navy, from 2019 until 2022. He's also a submariner, and while he operated nuclear-powered attack submarines armed with conventional rather than nuclear weapons, he knows a lot about the deterrent patrols as well.
So it's a nuclear-powered submarine with nuclear weapons that will sail, it will dive, and it will effectively vanish. It will patrol the ocean.
How does it vanish?
It will go to a patrol area in the ocean, and it will effectively patrol at slow speed, very slow speed, so it's very quiet, and it will detect everything else, so it will effectively keep itself away from anything it detects. So it will just literally act like a sort of a hole in the water for the period of its patrol, whilst maintaining constant communications with the UK.
I mean, like obviously, this is a horrific thing to think of, but if like the worst happened and the Prime Minister decided he needed to launch a nuclear weapon, then what happens?
Well, you get a firing message. So
what does that mean?
So a firing message, so an authenticated signal will come to the submarine. That will then be checked on board against a series of previously held firing messages. So it will be it will effectively be authenticated, and people will have seen Crimson Tide, where they break open pieces of a crypto and they look at it and they authenticate the firing message. It's a bit like that. It's not quite like that. And then the submarine will be prepared to fire a weapon, and it will literally go to periscope depth, or go through the process to launch a nuclear weapon. That's what happens. That's what it's trained to do. That's why it exists. God forbid it should never do that, but that's why it exists.
Like most defence programmes, the project to replace the current fleet of nuclear submarines is running late. though that was largely down to political hold-ups in approving the renewal plans when David Cameron's coalition government was in power. But the delay is being felt today, with the old fleet remaining in service for years longer than anticipated, and that carries an increased risk of failure. There's also a shortage of submariners because of historic cuts to the Navy, compounded by challenges with recruitment and retention. It all means the Navy has had to extend the length of its deterrent patrols to more than 200 days at sea, double the time they used to be. This puts a strain on the workforce as well as the boats, and raises the possibility of the continuous part of what's known as the Continuous At-Sea Deterrent, or CASD, being broken. And that would be a disaster, compromising the UK and NATO's entire deterrent strategy.
I think that's probably, if there is such a thing, the thing that keeps the First Sea Lord up at night is maintaining CASD. And it probably should keep the Prime Minister up at night.
Did it used to keep you up at night?
It was the thing I used to worry about most. There was plenty of other things to worry about and keep you up at night. So it wasn't, there was really there was an underlying necessity to make sure that was done. And we worked as hard, we expended an enormous amount of effort. It was always my number one priority when I was a Second Sea Lord, which was to deliver more submarine availability.
Along with renewing its nuclear deterrent, the UK also wants to evolve its conventional weapons as technology transforms the battlefield. This, of course, involves money, but it also needs a more dynamic approach to procurement and a willingness to scrap some legacy programmes, which is not something the military likes to do. Ben Wallace again.
When you wanted to try and modernise defence, and you would say, look, you should cut this, do less of this to give yourself some headroom.
Less of what?
I wanted to cut. We have one of the biggest Chinook fleets in Europe.
He's talking about a transport helicopter with 2 rotors that's made by the American company Boeing. The RAF has around 50 Chinook aircraft and wants to buy another 14.
What we also learn from Ukraine is that helicopters are very, very vulnerable on the modern battlefield. So we had got ourselves on the hook for some extended range Chinooks, 14 of them, on top of those 50. It did allow us to retire some others, but the bill was growing. It was growing from, I think, 1.4 billion, went up 500 million to 2 billion for 14 helicopters. And I said, enough of this, right? We don't need these helicopters. We need to cancel them, and we need to find a way to use that money on drones or something modern. Well, the system did not like that at all, because they wanted to look like the Americans. They wanted to have the same ones the Americans had. And in fact, I never got to cancel it because they waited till I left, and then my successors didn't cancel it.
So are we still getting those?
We're still getting them, and I think the bill will be now $2.4 billion for 14 aircraft. So when people say we're tight on money, some of that is this culture of not letting go, because they fear if they let go of it, if they'd let go and saved £1 billion, that immediately that £1 billion would be taken out of the helicopter budget, either back to Treasury or spent on another programme in another service. So it drives that sort of, it's like a sort of, when a teenager doesn't want to lose something, or a child doesn't want to lose something, they hold on to it, despite the logic of it. And that's just a culture of 30 years.
There is a much wider cultural point that's also worth making. The majority of people in the UK and the politicians they vote for only really remember life after the Cold War, when this country chose to reap a peace dividend and prioritise things like health and welfare over warfare. It means, as the defence secretaries we've heard from over the last 2 episodes swapped in and out of the MOD, our collective memory and culture of what it takes for a country to be ready for war faded. Perhaps that was a risk worth taking when the threat of conflict on the home front was minimal, but ask any security expert and they will tell you that's not the case anymore.
Russia has the weapons already, and has had for many years, to attack us on our island. They might not want to attack it for invasion purposes, but they certainly would like to attack it for what we stand for our economic power, and indeed because of the support we give to countries like Ukraine.
By 2023, concern was escalating inside the UK military about the erosion of its ability to fight should Russia's war in Ukraine spread across Europe. That year, Wallace publicly acknowledged the armed forces had been hollowed out by both Conservative and Labour governments. It was a highly unusual admission of weakness by a serving Defence Secretary.
Why did you decide to do that?
I think credibility, right? I think I needed to make the case for more funding for defence, and you don't do that by pretending everything's fine when it's not. You have to be honest about it. The amount of effort successive Number 10 Downing Streets put in to not telling the public the threats they're under, I can only surmise after my 7.5 years, both as Security Minister and Defence Minister, is because if the public knew, we'd have to spend money on it. And Prime Ministers don't like to make those difficult choices. To lead is to choose. And if they really knew, then the public would say, let's spend more money on it. And that means they'd have to cut something else. And they don't want to do that.
But Downing Street has huge control over who's allowed to talk about defence and what they can say. I've seen this caution grow over the years, in line with the widening gap between government rhetoric about the UK's strength and the hollow reality in the ranks. Given the classified nature of the subject, no service person, including the top brass, is allowed to speak to a journalist like me without permission. But that's increasingly rarely given. So they end up gambling with their careers for daring to have a coffee and a chat off the record, or for straying from the government line when speaking in public. The same can be true for defence secretaries, though they do have a bit more leeway. Wallace was once rebuked for stating the glaringly obvious.
I remember getting told off when I said, look, it's not realistic to say we have a division that we can just deploy.
A division is at least 15,000 troops.
We probably could cobble one together over time, but we can't immediately press a button and deploy a division, an armoured division in a way we would claim.
And what do you mean you got told off when you sort of spoke out about the fact we don't have a division?
Well, because no one likes to point out the Emperor doesn't have any new clothes. And that's what was happening.
Wallace chose to leave his post in 2023, handing over to another senior minister, Grant Shapps, whose CV rather reflects the fluidity of government during that period. He'd previously served as Energy Secretary, Business Secretary, Home Secretary for 6 days, and Transport Secretary. But Shapps says the most important department is the Ministry of Defence.
So the heavy responsibility very, very quickly descends onto your shoulders.
He was rapidly made aware of the need to fight for more funds, warning in early 2024, also in an unusually frank speech for a serving Defence Secretary, that the UK was entering a pre-war world.
I said we moved from a post-war to perhaps a pre-war world, not because we were immediately going to war, but because we need to rearm.
And was that your language?
Yes.
Was that your decision to say that? And it was a deliberate messaging to Number 10 to, listen?
Yes. And
were you under pressure not to do that?
So interestingly, with that speech, and this works, this is how Whitehall works, as you know, whatever ministerial position you hold, if you're making a major speech, then that was a speech that will have been sort of live televised and what have you. It was, during a significant moment in the Ukraine conflict. My team sent it across to Number 10. And although there were a few things that they commented on, they were not redlining my speech, which I thought was interesting in itself, because usually something like that could create a real problem.
This was back when the government, under Rishi Sunak, had merely promised to inch defence spending up to 2.5% of GDP from just over 2%, but only when economic conditions would allow. The then Prime Minister did belatedly lift that caveat, but only by pledging to hit the new target by 2030. He presented this as a decisive shift by his government to take defence seriously once again.
I believe we must do more to defend our country, our interests and our values. So today I'm announcing the biggest strengthening of our national defence for a generation.
But it was all seen as far too slow and unambitious by those of us who follow defence, and it's actually what prompted me to want to make this podcast, to try to better explain the true scale of the challenge.
When I lifted the bonnet, it was to see that, we were really unprepared. And I don't blame the last government, because everyone took the peace dividend, right through. And we were configured for a different age than the one that we are now facing.
Sir Keir Starmer came to power in 2024 when public awareness about the need to regrow the armed forces was finally starting to be revived. The Prime Minister asked George Robertson, the former Defence Secretary we met in episode 6, to produce a new defence review, almost 30 years on from his last one. Robertson is telling me what he discovered when he stepped back inside the MOD.
But, we don't have enough ammunition, we don't have enough logistics, we don't have enough trained soldiers, the training is not right, and we don't have enough medics to take the casualties that would be involved in a full-scale war.
Were you quite shocked with what you saw? Was it worse than you thought it would be?
Much worse than I thought it had been. And
compared to when you were Defence Secretary?
I think so. In terms of what we were facing in the world today, because that's the comparison. The Ministry of Defence, when I was there, was configured for the world as it was then. Northern Ireland being a big preoccupation. But, in 2024, we were not configured for the kind of world that had developed out there. But, that was a process of gradually over the years getting to that point. And
but who is to blame for this?
Well, we're all collectively to blame. And we made a
as
point.
In the politicians and the military chiefs.
Yeah.
And the public, maybe even.
I think that, by and large, the public, but they are led by the politicians. So we're all culpable, and we're very clear in the review. So we basically said, here's the world that we've got today, and it's dangerous, and we are underinsured, and we're underprepared for it. Therefore, the British people are not safe. But this is what we can do about it.
Yet, despite the flashing warning lights, the new Labour government chose not to list rebuilding the UK's armed forces as one of its 5 national missions, instead focusing on more familiar concerns, such as health, the economy and clean energy. Starmer didn't even initially match the Conservatives by setting a date by which he'd lift defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. I can only think this lack of attention on UK defence and wider national resilience is because he and his cabinet are a product of the post-Cold War era. While they know the threat of confrontation with Russia has returned, they, like most of the rest of us, don't instinctively understand what it means to have a military equipped to defend the home front, backed by a population that's prepared for war.
During the war, everybody has problems. Even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. Remember this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
It seemed to take a devastating showdown in the White House between a newly reinstated Donald Trump and Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, in early 2025 to put defence on Starmer's radar.
We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
The bust-up prompted the UK and France to say they'd rally a coalition of the willing to help secure Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire, while also working behind the scenes to try to mend ties between Washington and Kyiv. Though decades of defence cuts means what Britain's armed forces can offer in reality in terms of warships, jets and boots on the ground is thin. Donald Trump's second innings as America's commander-in-chief then did something even the renewed threat from Russia had failed to achieve.
In a very historic milestone this week, the NATO allies committed to dramatically increase their defense spending to that 5% of GDP, something that no one really thought possible. And they said, "You did it, sir, you did it." Well, I don't know if I did it, but I think I did.
The president was speaking at a NATO summit in June, after allies agreed to spend 5% of national income on defence and security, amid fears he would withdraw the US military from the alliance. It marks a big jump from the previous target of 2%, but there's still evidence of a bluff. Pure defence spending accounts for 3.5%, which is a meaningful rise. Yet the rest comprises vague security-related things, such as roads and railways, and none of it has to happen until 2035, a sluggish timeline that I understand the Starmer government had pushed for behind the scenes, much to the frustration of some allies who wanted to go a lot faster.
So I think what it saddens me about is they're going back to the old ways, which is spin, avoiding the truth.
Ben Wallace again.
A culture that is all front of house and nothing behind it. That's what really worries me. I can take some party political banter, it doesn't really bother me. But ultimately, fixing the problem is going to require real money and real commitment, not political parlour games.
As I speak, a Russian spy ship, the Yantar, is on the edge of UK waters north of Scotland, having entered the UK's wider waters, mapping our undersea cables.
John Healey, Labour's current Defence Secretary, was not playing games when he issued a stark warning in November to Vladimir Putin over the actions of a Russian spy ship.
We deployed a Royal Navy frigate and RAF P-8 planes to monitor and track this vessel's every move, during which the Yantar directed lasers at our pilots. That Russian action is deeply dangerous, and this is the second time this year that this ship, the Yantar, has deployed to UK waters. So my message to Russia and to Putin is this: we see you, we know what you're doing, and if the Yantar travels south this week, we are ready.
I'd caught up with the Defence Secretary a couple of days earlier when he visited one of the Royal Navy's 2 aircraft carriers off the coast of Italy. HMS Prince of Wales, loaded with F-35 jets, is returning from a deployment to the other side of the world to test its readiness for war.
This is a carrier that has demonstrated in exercises around the world with allies that it is fully mission ready for NATO at 10 days notice, ready for the UK at 5 days notice. And this is a good example of how we meet this new era of threats with hard power and strong alliances.
But there are those that sort of, are still critical that the UK is still bluffing when it comes to its defences. Yes, we're talking about increasing spending, but not at the speed that other allies like Germany are doing. What do you say to that? Are we bluffing?
Well, it's certainly the case that, as a previous Conservative defence minister said, over the last 14 years, before the last election, our forces were hollowed out and underfunded. We changed that in the first year in this government, an extra $5 billion into defence, a certain 10 years now of rising defence spending. But it isn't just how much we spend, it's how we spend it. And so you will see the decisions that I have to take
leading to the transformation of our forces so that we become the most innovating military in NATO. The carrier is part of the leading edge of that. And we will rectify the position we found ourselves in, that this country had been left in with a military equipment plans that were overcommitted, that were underfunded and unsuited to the rapidly escalating and changing threats that we face.
Yet, as we heard in the previous episode, that's exactly the state the coalition government found defence to be in when they took over from Labour 15 years ago. The difference now is the scale of the threat compared with back then. I challenged Healy again on his government's timeline to lift defence spending, as there are reports that the military is still, even now, being required to make savings because money is so tight.
But are you worried that it's not happening fast enough? Because we're hearing talk of exercises being cut, and things not happening now because the money isn't here now.
Well, we got an extra $5 billion in the defence budget for the first year. We're hitting a 2.5% of what this country produces, the GDP, 3 years earlier than anyone expected. We've got 10 years of a rising defence spending. We will use that money wisely. We will use it to transform our military so that we are more ready to fight, better able to deter, and more able to work with allies, because in the end, it's demonstrated by this carrier, our strength is with our allies, alongside our allies, helping to lead and coordinate our allies.
The reality, though, as I mentioned in episode 6, is that the UK lacks sufficient escort ships and crews to be able to operate the carriers and fulfil all the other jobs the Navy does without our allies. To pretend otherwise risks fostering this illusion of power that's been allowed to grow in the place of actually regaining military strength. It is true that things are belatedly being fixed. Defence spending will now hit 2.5% of GDP by 2027, and there are plans to build more weapons factories and invest in new drones, warplanes and submarines. But defence insiders tell me they're worried the UK is still moving far too slowly. They point to Germany, which for obvious historical reasons hasn't prioritised defence until recently, but is now even getting all 18-year-old men to undergo medical checks for potential national service. Elsewhere in Europe, Denmark has expanded a conscription programme to include women as well as men. Poland plans to add thousands more troops to its ranks in the next year, while the Baltic states will hit the new NATO spending target early. And then there are the words of France's military chief, who's warned his country they must prepare for the possibility of losing their children in a war with Russia. France, too, is introducing a new form of military service for its young people. Contrast all of that with a report by a committee of MPs which accused the British government of moving at a glacial pace to rebuild its defences and of failing to launch a promised national conversation on defence and security. It's strong criticism, and our Wargame shows what's at stake. By playing out what might happen if Russia attacked, we've demonstrated that the UK right now lacks the ability to defend itself from large-scale missile strikes and is unprepared and out of practice when it comes to the transition from peace to war. It's why understanding the decisions that successive governments have made on national defence and resilience since the end of the Cold War is so important. As we've learnt throughout this series, those decisions were largely taken in a different era, when war on the home front was deemed to be a horror of the past. But when that threat changes, then maybe our choices have to as well. The Wargame was written and presented by me, Deborah Haynes. The series producer is James Shield. Episode production by Matt Russell. The development producer is Jess Swinburne. Original music and sound design are by Tom Kinsella. Additional production by Katie Scholes. The editor for Tortoise is Jasper Corbett. For Sky News, the commissioning editor is Paul Stanworth, and the executive producers are Sarah Whitehead and David Mapstone.
Okay, there's a lot of firing going on.
3 minutes, you need to go from here.
Okay.
Unless you want to be arrested.
Can you explain to me why? We're journalists, sir.
If you weren't affected, you'd be a bit of a strange person.
So that is what it's like. Sometimes you have to put in an awful lot of hard work. It's worth doing. I suppose it is what we do.
Feel the heat of the front line with Alex Crawford, Stuart Ramsey and their teams in the new series of Hotspots. Just search Sky News Hotspots on YouTube to subscribe.
Hey, it's Sophie and Will from Sky News.
Too many headlines, too little time?
We get it, and that's why we're bringing you Cheat Sheet.
10 minutes every weekday morning.
All the big stories from politics to pop culture, minus the noise.
No doom scrolling, no spin, just the stories that matter from two people who live and breathe the news. Cheat Sheet with Ridge and Frost from Sky News.
Follow Cheat Sheet wherever you get your podcasts.